You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Ben Holland, Senior Associate at the Rocky Mountain Institute. We talk about the disconnect between techno-optimists and urbanists, RMI's new Colorado Induced travel calculator, and much, much more. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We've shared a few of the episodes on our Monday show, but I want to make sure folks hop on over for a behind-the-scenes look at what makes cities tick. Every month, Anthony Flint interviews leading experts, policymakers, and thinkers on topics ranging from housing to climate change to infrastructure, exploring how these issues can all be traced back to land. Some of my favorite recent interviews feature leaders like Lisa Rice of the National Fair Housing Alliance discussing racism and housing policy, and Bill McKibben on decarbonization. So open up your podcatcher and add Land Matters from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. Find it on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast is brought to you by our generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much for supporting the show each month. We really appreciate it. To join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Join at $2 a month and you'll get a handwritten note and some stickers. $10 a month and you'll get one of our popular bus-only scarves. And all supporters will have access to bonus audio, including extras from our discussions with guests, such as Carol Martins, Chris Pahalski, and Andrew Simpson of the Philadelphia Office of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Sustainability, and soon Laura Schul of Streetlight Data. Thanks so much for supporting the show. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Well, Ben Holland, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Big fan of it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. We've known each other for quite a while. For those that don't know you, though, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I work at Rocky Mountain Institute, or I should call it RMI now. We just went through kind of a rebranding. Just a little bit of background on RMI. We are an energy and climate-focused nonprofit founded by Amory and Hunter Lovins about 40 years ago here in Colorado, but very much global in reach now. And the bulk of our work is really focused on identifying and implementing zero carbon solutions for kind of the energy intensive sectors. So those being buildings, electricity, transportation, and in the industrial sector. And I work on transportation.
Cool. And then how did you get into transportation? What was the introduction for you?
I kind of fell into it, honestly. So I've worked at RMI twice. The first stint really starting back in 2009, and I came on board on the communications team. I had moved here to Boulder, Colorado from Richmond, Virginia, and worked kind of on communications and marketing for a while, but just sort of found that I gravitated toward the transportation work. I had a colleague named Matt Matilla who brought me on board the transportation team basically to help manage an initiative called Project Get Ready, which was focused on helping cities. This was at the outset of the electric vehicle market, but helping cities kind of prepare for and spur the adoption of electric vehicles. Much of my footwork now is focused on kind of non-electric vehicle transportation strategies.
Did you know, though, when you were younger that cities were important, that they were interesting, that they had some sort of pull?
Yeah, I don't think I really placed it or thought about it so much until we had an initiative down in Austin that I can talk about in a little bit. But, I lived in a part of Richmond called the Fan, which surrounds a university there, Virginia Commonwealth University. And it's in many ways kind of your classic urbanist environment. You've got a mix of sixplexes and single family detached homes, row houses, corner stores, and things of that nature. And when I moved to Boulder, I don't think it really connected with me. And honestly, I thought the sort of urban form, the low rise, cottagey feel of Boulder was sort of an organic thing rather than zoned that way. It didn't really dawn on me. It didn't really connect with me until I started working with the Congress for the New Urbanism's Central Texas chapter, Mateo Barnstone down there and some of his colleagues, as well as the other sort of urbanist and YIMBY groups down in Austin, and actually started listening to your podcast a bunch. So that's why, really over the last 3 years or so is when I would say it became kind of an urbanism convert. I mean, I'm simplifying it, but most of my mind in the environmental space was really focused on technology solutions. And I just really kind of, having been introduced to the CNU, I was able to better understand what it was that I loved about Richmond. And it dawned on me how difficult it is for cities to embrace that kind of urban form. So that's sort of what's been interesting me for the last few years.
What's your take on Boulder?
Yeah, so I'm also on the board of an organization called Better Boulder. I don't know if you've read Golden Gates by Connor Doherty, but he features it in the first chapter, I think, because we initiated, I believe, the first YIMBY conference. I was living in Austin at the time. Much of our work is focused on housing advocacy and to some extent transportation advocacy as well. Boulder is obviously a very homogenous town and also ostensibly a very progressive and environmentalist town. And it's not until the last few years of working on cities, urbanism, and transportation policy and housing policy that I've started to realize sort of the hypocrisy to some extent of your classic environmental Boulderite. So, which is to say that we have a lot of work to do, I think, to be more accommodating and inclusive in the city, to embrace more forward-thinking housing policies. So that's what we're working toward on Better Boulder.
It's interesting, Connor was like actually the last person we had in the studio before the pandemic started. And so I remember actually kind of elbow bumping him on his way out because we knew something was going on, and then everything kind of shut down. And so the book was really good. And I hope folks if they didn't get a chance to listen to the episode, they go get a chance to read the book because it's pretty powerful in its discussion of housing issues and what's going on around the country, even though it mostly talks about California.
Yeah, well, he also wrote a really great piece for the New York Times about Boulder. So during that YIMBY conference, he came out to report on it from what I understand. And while he was here, he did a fair amount of interviews and he wrote this whole piece about, in a sense, kind of about the hypocrisy of environmental movement in Boulder and the sort of exclusionary zoning policies. So it's a pretty interesting piece.
Well, let's talk about the environmental movement more broadly. We have this climate change specter looming above us, all the discussion about, focusing on reducing emissions, making sure the ice sheets don't melt, sea level rise, all those things. And I think there's an internal struggle going on between folks that think that we need better technology and folks that think we need land use change. I'm curious what you've seen from the kind of back and forth inside the environmental community, even if it's not out there in the world as a kind of a larger discussion.
Yeah, so I've become kind of a single issue person on this, or like I have this singular mission, I think, around trying to bridge those silos of the kind of tried and true transportation policy world, transportation advocacy. And again, I'm talking about things in terms of transportation. Let's call it like just good policy. And also on the other side, very much the technocratic, techno-economic centered, I guess, climate advocacy crowd. So, you have the technology will save the world from climate change crowd that has what I've recognized within the climate community. That focus is very understandable. We do need, for instance, a great deal of electric vehicles on the road by 2030. And I can get into that target here in a little bit. We do need those zero carbon technologies, but I fear, and actually I think it's becoming more universally understood with our other peers in the environmental space, that focus on technology has been at the cost of some of the really good policies that we needed, like equitable policies that we need to see put into place. So just prioritizing transit, rebalancing our priorities in all of our transportation investments, in particular highway investments, and enabling people to have greater access to alternatives to the single occupancy vehicle. So I feel like that those two worlds are still somewhat disconnected, and trying to kind of build this united coalition of environmental organizations to elevate the importance of a comprehensive vision for transportation climate strategy. And I think it's starting to gain a little steam.
Do you think the technologists understand the land use transportation connection, or is it kind of not understood because it's a little bit out of their wheelhouse typically?
I think it's generally not well understood. I think it's given very little attention to. And if it is somewhat understood, there's a sentiment within the community that, and I understand this as well, but that we don't have enough time to improve the connection between land use and transportation. For instance, reform our zoning to allow more infill and mixed use development. We need technologies that scale fast, and scale, the word scale is used quite often. And
sounds like Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much like, I think climate space has very much adopted the Silicon Valley ethos in some ways, but that's another thing we're trying to push back on to some extent, is this sentiment that it's too hard to accomplish those things and it takes too long to achieve.
Well, what about the language? I mean, so it's interesting. There was a news report the other night talking about here in California, redwood trees are really, good for bringing in carbon and storing it basically in their wood. And then there's a discussion about, building a huge grove of redwood trees up the coast and allowing them to grow, allowing them to sequester carbon. And the language is really interesting. They were talking about taking 3.5 million cars off the road. And it's like, why are we trying to plant trees to equate taking cars off the road when we can just take cars off the road? There's always this weird language that's happening. I think people innately understand that you need to reduce emissions through transportation, but they always want to do it another way that doesn't mean that they maybe have to reduce some of their trips.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, too, like, why don't we try to stop building into like the urban wildland interface, whatever you want to call it? Like, it's kind of interesting that we're talking about planting redwoods at a time that like development is encroaching into those spaces even more. And and environmentalists are doing very little to, I think, stop that. But yeah, as far as taking vehicles off the road, I'm with you on that. That's one of the challenges, I think, from a messaging standpoint that I'm struggling with, and then some of our peers are struggling with, is how to communicate what needs to be done in transportation climate. We run the risk sometimes of saying, we're going to take your cars away from you, or we want you to drive less, even though we do, but rather, I think it's important to reframe it in context of access. So yeah, I think that there's this sort of cognitive disconnect in a lot of ways that I feel like is breaking down a bit.
Yeah, you might notice that I'm very careful with my words in saying that I'm not trying to take away your car. I don't think that that's a reasonable outcome. And I do believe electrification is important, but at the same time, I think there's a potential to reduce trips. One of the things that, I've seen lately is that, we can do so much through electrification, but then you get that last 25%. And I think this was in actually a Colorado Public Radio report that came out yesterday talking about the CDOT's expansion of freeways in the state of Colorado. And, thinking about, you can do so much through electrification, through trying to not expand freeways, but that last kind of 25%, that last bit, you really do need to reduce people's trips, try to make sure that you reduce VMT. And I think they understand that innately, but then at the same time, it seems like they're still trying to expand freeways, which is this weird cognitive dissonance thing that's going on.
Yeah, so a big part of our work at RMI now on the urban transformation team that I'm on is really focused on that VMT reduction part of the problem. And, the first step to reducing VMT is to stop increasing it. And that's why we've kind of taken a stance on induced travel through highway expansions. And I guess I should step back a little bit because I haven't mentioned this yet, but our organization recently aligned, like a lot of other environmental organizations, has aligned around the IPCC's carbon budget of 1.5 degrees Celsius, so basically limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. And we've kind of narrowed that down to the US, where it's a 50% reduction in carbon emissions, which is in keeping with Joe Biden's NDC. And within transportation, our analysis suggests that to hit those targets by 2030, we would need to see a ton of electric vehicles on the road, basically 70 million EVs on the road by 2030. And even under that very ambitious and optimistic scenario, we would still need to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 20% per capita, is what we found. And yeah, it's that 20% that I'm really focused on. I found that, when you mention the 70 million EVs to a lot of people in the space, there's this enthusiasm about it. There's no lack of optimism about it. Like, this is a moonshot. We're going to hit that, no problem. The VMT reduction piece falls on deaf ears a lot of times and just doesn't seem very compelling to some of the audiences we've talked to. But again, I feel like we're making ground, or gaining ground, I should say. Going back to the CDOT or the Colorado discussion, we were looking at the work that UC Davis had done on their induced demand calculator, and our work is very much just sort of an adaptation of that. So we got on the phone with Jamie Volker and Susan Handy, as well as some of our other partners, NRDC and SWEEP, and decided to expand that to Colorado. And we did not anticipate the reaction that we got. But for the most part, I think it's been pretty positive. We've had some very positive discussions with CDOT, and we're looking forward to sort of exchanging notes on our respective modeling going forward. In the coming months, we'll be producing a national scope 50-state induced demand calculator and potentially doing some more kind of targeted outreach and advocacy in specific states.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the emissions calculator? You did this work with Zach Subin and Lainey Rowland, and I'm curious kind of how you came up with it. And you mentioned Susan Handy how you came up with it, and kind of, you mentioned some of the reactions to it. I'm curious what the reactions have been so far, and positive and negative.
Yeah. So Zach and Laney would be much better explaining it than me, but basically just put it simply, there is sort of a robust set of literature that suggests that the benefits of highway expansions are short-lived, on the order of 5 years or so. And then ultimately the congestion will return. All kind of congestion mitigation efforts eventually end in more congestion. And looking at sort of the landscape literature and real sort of evidence-based research, the numbers would kind of on average look like for every 1% increase of lane miles, you should expect ultimately a 1% increase in VMT. So we looked at all of the different projects that are under consideration in Colorado's transportation plan, and found that if all of the expansions go through, we should anticipate between a 2 to 3% increase in VMT on Colorado highways. This comes at a time when, Colorado is one of 5 or 6 states, I think, that actually have a VMT reduction goal. Their goal is a 10% reduction in VMT. So it's going to be very difficult to achieve that by 2030 if you're also vastly expanding the highways. There's also this issue of better understanding what the impacts are of travel mitigation strategies like high occupancy toll lanes or managed lanes, basically. And to CDOT's credit, they do have plans to implement the managed lanes. However, in the research that we've done and that UC Davis has done, there's sort of scant evidence that it has a material reduction in VMT if you are expanding the highway to put the managed lane in. So I think as far as our perspective goes, we don't see any reason why we shouldn't use managed lanes on the existing infrastructure. I mean, certainly there is a congestion benefit there and a behavioral change benefit, moving more people to transit potentially if, that you have a bus priority lane and the managed lane. But if you're expanding the highway to create the managed lane, then it's possible that it'll be a wash.
What's been the reaction, though? I'm curious, to hear kind of the positive and the negatives as well.
Very quickly, we got a response from the local media. Colorado Public Radio just published their piece yesterday. That was after I think 2 or 3 weeks that Nate Miner was interviewing people and did pretty thorough research for the article. Before that, we had a couple, I would say it was a mixed bag. Some skepticism around, whether or not induced demand was real. But then, Streets Blog wrote a great piece about the benefits of this calculator, and we're pretty excited to see that. As far as the state of Colorado Energy Office, and CDOT, they, I think, understandably, they felt a bit taken aback by it. And we've always had a really strong working relationship, especially Colorado Energy Office and CDOT, and we will going forward. We're really close with Will Torr over at Colorado Energy Office. I think from my perspective, it started a very necessary conversation that we hope we can help elevate nationally. So better understanding and modeling the impacts of our transportation investments. I think there's a general belief in the concept of induced demand. However, our observation is that it gets insufficiently built into kind of traditional travel demand models and DOT models out there.
Yeah, one of the other things in the article that I thought was interesting is that they're trying to rely on large companies to do more carpooling, vanpooling, transit passes, and less single occupancy vehicles, kind of like a TDM type of program. And then they also have these carbon budgets, which was really interesting to read about too. I thought that was interesting that they have a total carbon budget for how much, they can build. You would think that would limit the amount of building they would do rather than repair, but it seems like, there's still some expansion plans going on in the next 10 years.
Yeah, and that's promising, but we need to make sure that carbon budget is applied to the existing planned projects and that we kind of hold their feet to the fire on that one. There's definitely reason to be optimistic about their plans. We definitely want to applaud them for, again, they're considering managed lanes. They've also referenced microtransit, mobility hubs, as you said, TDM programs. These are all great things, but I think they also suffer from the larger problem that we have in modeling carbon emissions associated with transportation, is that they're largely not modeled. We have a problem with a lack of data on, for instance, what would the VMT reduction potential be, or carbon emissions reduction potential of a microtransit last mile fleet? Like, no one really knows. And likewise, I think for a lot of other great things. We need to get a lot clearer on what the benefits are, because as long as there's this kind of this murky territory around understanding what the impacts are, the policymakers are always going to kind of default to the sort of easy solution, which has been by 2050, all cars will be electric, And then again, there's this unwavering optimism that will happen. I mean, my stance on it is, okay, let's make sure that it happens. But in the meantime, let's stop the blood from letting, basically, when it comes to VMT increasing across our roads. And let's start prioritizing the transportation investments that we know not only reduce emissions, but give people greater access to mobility.
I think one of the most frustrating things for me with EVs is the lack of discussion about particulates. Even if you take out the gasoline portion of the fuel, there's still rubber tire particles, there's still brake dust, there's still other things that can, contribute to childhood asthma and other things that we've talked about many times on the show. I understand people have to get around, and I drive when I need to. I don't have a car, but it's necessary in a lot of places in the United States. But we're not talking about some of these other things that I think are also important as it pertains to not just, reducing climate change effects, but also, the health effects that highways and, single occupancy transportation have on neighborhoods.
Yeah, I agree. I think that has not been given sufficient attention. I know there's kind of a raging debate over what the contribution is of tires and brakes and, road resuspension, I guess, or kicking up the road dust, I guess. But, and you may know this better than me, but it seems like we can sort of generally expect that it's going to be for PM 2.5 and 10, I think, but like half of the particulates are associated with non-exhaust. So yeah, that's a major problem too. I also heard recently, which might be common sense to a lot of people, but tire wear is a significant portion of ocean pollution and just, particles in the ocean.
We just saw research here in the Bay Area that said, how many billions of particles of rubber tire pollution there is in the Bay.
That's what I'm referencing.
I can imagine that goes into the oceans as well. And we have a huge plastics problem generally from not just rubber tires, but everything else, water bottles and things like that get into the ocean, into the water systems. Then, it's hard to filter all that stuff out, even if you have a really great filtration system. Yeah. And that causes its own problems related to, getting stuck in people's, digestive tracts and things like that. So definitely problems all around related to that.
As we're talking about this, I'm just conscious of the fact that, one of the things I still kind of struggle with is that there's always this sort of rebuttal to the other argument, and sort of more urbanist side of things will, argue that electric vehicles don't solve that problem. Certainly they don't fully. And then likewise, the electric vehicle crowd will argue that our solutions take too much time to achieve. We're in many ways just kind of talking at each other. The best example of that is just urbanism Twitter, which I love. I've probably gotten pulled into it more than I should, but you got like Matthew Lewis and a lot of other very vocal people on Twitter who I just absolutely adore. There's a kind of waging sort of a battle in some ways to elevate the importance of these things, but we also probably need to pull together more of a comprehensive partnership or collaboration with both sides of the issue. And for instance, and I don't want to like rag on the EV advocacy crowd because that came from that space, but the benefits of deploying sort of DC fast chargers along highway corridors are not worth like the detriment of expanding those highways. I've kind of seen that at times is willingness to get on board with very carbon intensive highway expansion, like auto-centric transportation policies, as long as we get these very small wins from my perspective. That comes up quite a bit. Like the charging infrastructure is, of course, extremely important and very much needed to enable widespread adoption of electric vehicles. However, it is not necessarily a metric for success in the battle against climate change, especially when compared to some of the more egregious things that are happening within our transportation system.
Yeah. I think also, I don't want to push on EV advocates too much. I don't think that that's really necessary, but there is this inertia related to, the existing system of being able to just kind of, sprawl everywhere and keep that kind of inertia going, that system going, which also affects a lot of other wildlife things, biomass diversity of plants and animals, those
Right.
types of things, the wildlife corridors. And so that's another frustrating part is that, yeah, I mean, if we had all of San Francisco electrified and through their buses and through the trains and through automobiles and Ubers and Lyfts and whatever else, scooters, transportation of all, it wouldn't even be that big of an issue because we're already contained in this 7 by 7 mile area. But then when you get outside, you have all these areas that would be developed by, sprawl development, and we need these housing. You have these huge housing needs that in a place like Austin, the reason why the prices are going up really high now is kind of the same situation as happening in California many, many years ago. But you have an escape valve kind of in the suburbs. You have Round Rock, you have Hayes County, you have all these places where housing is expanding at this incredible clip. And so the reason why Austin hasn't hit San Francisco prices yet is because you have a little bit of an escape valve. But if you cut off that escape valve and you can't develop in the core because you have a bunch of NIMBYs, then you have a bigger problem. And all this stuff creates an environmental problem too. So it's not just the cars and it's not just the transportation system overall. It's this kind of ecology of everything, it feels like to me.
Yeah, agreed. And, I love talking about Austin because I spent about 2 or 3 years there for RMI's project down there. And I think it's the perfect example, of some of the challenges we face. The leadership is very much environmentally oriented. Much of the sort of liberal, progressive, environmentalist council members and leaders over the past few years really came up in one of the most sort of well-known environmental campaigns in the history of Austin, which you'll be very familiar with, which is Save Our Springs, and very well-intentioned people all around. Austin interests me basically because, you do have this very progressive city government and, progressive populace for the most part, but major challenges with land use. That's the whole reason why I came into this space. I basically learned about land use, housing, zoning, urban transportation policy as the city of Austin and local advocates were battling out over Code Next, which would have been a comprehensive rewrite of the land development code. It hasn't been updated since 1983 or 4. You probably know.
70 something.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think it's even further back. Yeah.
It gets even more interesting now with the recent passing of the referendum for the transit expansion. So $7 billion funded through a property tax increase that will dramatically expand the light rail system in Austin, I think is also going to force the issue of our land use policies, or Austin's land use strategy, I guess.
And, to be fair, I think to everybody who's in these situations, you're kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't type of thing. You have many different pressures, including gentrification, displacement. East Austin is a big example of that. You have fears of losing community, which is a really important part of what Austin actually, is and remains. But making people move further and further away from the core to get a more affordable housing, that's another inequitable situation as well, making people drive so far to get to the places where they need to go. So it's frustrating on all fronts, I think, for everybody. And if we're going to be fair, we can't just put the blame on one group. There's got to be some sort of a grand bargain to make sure that everybody kind of gets what they need out of the deal without, sacrificing the environment. Yeah.
And this is something I struggle with a bit too, I think it's important to, first of all, not shame the opposition, if you want to call it that, but most importantly, it's important to have empathy, especially as you're wading into the conversations of housing and equity and transportation and zoning. Again, being here in Boulder, it's a very kind of it's like a little hamlet in a way of single family zoning, detached zoning. And I don't think it's the case that the only ones trying to maintain that zoning are, highly affluent owners of single family homes like McMansions or whatever you want to call them here in Boulder. I think there is a sentiment, even with younger people, even with renters, because maybe they don't really understand that it's sort of been engineered that way, but there's a very understandable fear of eradicating, the look and feel of your neighborhood, and that obviously has a problematic history and concepts of community character, but it's important, I think, to understand where people are coming from. And in Austin, you've got these older neighborhoods. It's an interesting place because you have a very tightly compact downtown that is surrounded within 2-minute walking distance by low slung, kind of low density neighborhoods like Zilker Park neighborhood, Travis Heights, Clarksville, those kinds of places. It's understandable there's been kind of a battle waged there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, let's go in a different direction now. I want to talk about, where does green infrastructure in natural systems, I think we talked about this just kind of briefly, but where does that fit into all of this discussion?
I should mention, I didn't really give it a good enough explanation, but we have this new team called the Urban Transformation Team that kind of brings to bear all the different disciplines and expertise within the energy sector into kind of a city context. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's the first time that we've had a true kind of city-focused program. And that will include a lot of the work that I'm doing around VMT reduction transportation. But we're also starting to build up a practice within that team, dedicated nature-based solutions. One of my colleagues, Julia Meisel, is leading that. It's an area where we need to produce a little more evidence and data around the benefits of things like wetlands restoration, green roofs, green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure. Because again, I think like policymakers aren't really armed with a data-driven defensible argument. I mean, we know these are good things, but I think it's worth the sort of intellectual exercise of really putting some numbers down, what we can achieve from water retention, reduction of the urban heat island effect, and those kinds of things. But I'm certainly not an expert in the space.
Yeah, I'm super interested in it just because I don't know a lot about it, but also it just seems like a really good way to preserve nature altogether. And I think your point about getting the data is really well founded. You probably need to know how much, acre feet of water that can be preserved by filtration through a meadow, and how big of that meadow creates how much water filtration that doesn't need to be done through gray water, concrete solutions and things like that. So if we can get those numbers, and maybe somebody's already started that and we just don't know about it. There's always people doing stuff that's really fascinating that I have just not read about or don't know about. So there's probably somebody out there doing it, but need to learn more. So we can kind of figure out how to, if we can monetize everything else in the world, we should be able to monetize, or at least figure out how to, save, the environment in that way. Maybe we can create a futures market for forests or something like that. I don't know. Maybe that's something that already exists for wood that's gone skyrocketing lately. But yeah. Okay, last question for you. What do you think of the American Jobs Plan and what the focus is on each kind of section?
What do you think about it?
What do I think about it? Right now, I'm frustrated by the lack of movement and the appeal to try to be politically bipartisan instead of voter bipartisan, which, if something's super popular with 60-something% of people, I think that it sounds bipartisan to me. So I'm frustrated with the way Washington works and the way that the Constitution set up rural areas to have more power than urban areas. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I mean, I also have a similar frustration with the political aspects of this. I would say, I'm very pleased with many of the elements in there, particularly around transportation. And I would say at the federal level, the people that President Biden has put into office or put into his cabinet in the transportation department across the board, in the climate space as well, have full faith and confidence in that leadership. And of course, this infrastructure bill, we're really excited about the potential of it, but I do have concerns about just the status quo of funding. For instance, again, transportation, a great deal of that funding going to more rural road projects rather than local governments. And that's one of the things that, again, we're kind of new in this space. We're trying to partner with as many organizations as possible because we recognize our limited understanding of sort of the politics of this, but we really want to help elevate cities in the climate strategy and get more funding to the cities rather than it getting gobbled up by state DOTs to do rural highway expansions.
I think I mentioned this in the newsletter this morning, but we've been doing 80 years of road building and focusing on investments that aren't necessarily active transportation. And so it's just frustrating to see kind of the status. People hope for some different outcome when still continuing doing the same things over and over again. And I see the investment in EVs as a good investment, but at the same time, it's still an investment in, roads and sprawl to me in that same kind of land use paradigm. And so I think that's what's frustrating to me, is that you can put in a bunch of transit money, but it's never going to, unless you can reverse that 80-20 split You're never really going to get back to a place where we're investing more in transportation that moves a lot of people versus a transportation that moves, a single occupant vehicle. So, there's a lot of work to be done to go push back on 80 years of investment on the other side. And if we keep on kind of incrementally, slowly investing in transit versus roads, I think that we're still going to lose out in the end.
Yeah. And I mean, I typically just defer to Beth Osborne on a lot of these things, especially the 80-20 split. And also, one of the things that we're trying to push within our network of climate peers is just the importance of the basic performance measures. So reinstituting greenhouse gas as a performance measure for transportation projects and doing that as soon as possible, because, we have limited time to really make a difference on that. So hopefully that's going to make it through either the infrastructure bill or the reauthorization of the FAST Act. I would say one other thing on the vision for infrastructure that was pretty exciting to us is just this concept of housing and especially infill housing as infrastructure. This first kind of came up in President Biden's climate plan when he was still a candidate for president, where I think for the first time you saw housing elevated as a climate solution, infill housing and zoning reform. And, President Obama released his sort of equitable housing toolkit, I think it was called, something like that, right before he exited office. We really haven't seen that level of support from the Democrats. That the inclusion of that concept of infill housing as either a climate tool or an infrastructure tool before. So kind of excited about that too.
Yeah, I'd like to see what happens with that. Well, Ben Holland, thank you for joining us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list, by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find a digital home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.